All right. So we are in our first substantive week in the book of Daniel. We did for those who are here, we did an introduction last week, and I'm sure some people found it interesting and some people found it mind-numbingly boring, but I think it was really important to set up the context of the book. I think it's important in any, especially the Old Testament books, but even New Testament, I think understanding the environment in which something is written, the language that it's written in, the things that were going on around it is important. It informs the substance. I think a lot of people go too far and really try to contextualize and try to pull the mystical out of the Bible, try to pull the inspiration out of it by saying, well, you can qualify just about everything because you have to read it through the lens of the person who wrote it at the time they wrote it, and they believed in mystical things back then, and really use that to downplay the spiritual aspect of some of the things that happen in the Bible, and it shows a low regard for the text. People that have a tendency to do that have a tendency to want to explain things away and say, well, certain miracles, certain things, well, those are just influences of the pagan societies that were around, and those are common themes in literature. Every society from that time and that culture had concepts of these things happening, and they really influenced the text. And so they use that sort of, you have to understand the times aspect of reading the Bible as a way to sterilize some of the stuff. We're not going down that road by any means, but I do think it is important to lay the foundation of any book that you're reading, because there are factors that influence, and there are things that you need to understand that are taken for granted in the text, that they just assume the reader knows based on what's going on. And so I think we invested in that, but this week is the first week of a substantive study for people who aren't really what I would call students of the Bible, who aren't regular in studying the Bible. Most people have spent some time in Daniel just because it's an entertaining read. It's a very straightforward storyline, and then at the same time there are just some really impressive elements to it. So it's a very fun book to study, and as I've been saying all along, I think it's half the value is just awe of the text. It's just being blown away by the precision of prophecy and the things that are going on in Daniel's life, and how God is at the center of all these things. And so that makes this fun, in addition to what we've been doing throughout this whole study, and just really pursuing Christ in every aspect of the Bible, and seeing what do we learn about him in every page and every story. They're not just entertainment. They're not just narratives to try to teach you something as if you are the focal point of the Bible. It all points to him, and we want to highlight that as we go through. This week, we mentioned last week that the most important thing to realize is that the book of Daniel is not in chronological order. It's in two different segments. The first 6 books are the historical books where he tells a narrative. And then chapters 7 through 12, he kind of goes back to the beginning of his ministry and starts detailing certain visions that he has. And they lay out really the prophetic scheme. Mentioned last week, Daniel was not considered a prophet by the Jews, right? The prophet was an office within the church, within the synagogue. And it's a Levitical order. There were obligations of the prophet. The prophet was the voice of God to the people. Daniel is not doing that. You won't find a time when Daniel is interpreting or sharing God's word to the people. He writes things that he hears. On occasion, we'll see one of the most profound prophecies in all of the Bible was given to him directly by an angel, and he records it. But the church isn't even in existence. Israel is not established as a nation. The temple's been destroyed. He's not declaring God's word to the people. He is unique among all the prophets in that God gave him this ability to interpret visions, and he had dreams that had significance himself. And so he's recording things that he saw and recording things that God revealed to him, but he is not acting as that voice. And so from a strict Jewish standpoint, he was not considered one of the prophets because he never held the office of a prophet. He was an administrator within pagan governments. And so very, very unique in that regard, but we obviously consider him as one of the prophets, and we are now in the historical section, just getting started. And this week we will deal with first the deportation of Daniel and many of the elite Jewish youth to Babylon, and then we'll go through Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And like I said, it's very straightforward storytelling, so it goes pretty quick, but there are some really interesting insights as we go through. In terms of our timeline that we dealt with last week, you remember we talked about all of the world politics, the global empires were sort of culminating in this area at one time. The Assyrian Empire was the dominant force in the world. They had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. It had been wiped off the map. And then a few years later, Egypt, Pharaoh Necho makes war against the Assyrian Empire, goes through Israel to make war against the Assyrian Empire, and Josiah, who was one of the few righteous kings, all of a sudden fights back against Pharaoh Necho, and even Pharaoh Necho goes, well, what are you doing? We're making war with Assyria, and that's Israel's historic enemy. There's some context behind that we'll get to, but really Josiah was told by God to make war with Pharaoh Necho, but that battle kind of stalemates, and at the same time, this small city-state within the Assyrian Empire called Babylon starts to rise, and a guy named Nebuchadnezzar, who was Nebuchadnezzar's father, starts to rebel against the Assyrian Empire while they're at war with Egypt. He marches on the capital and takes over Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and then starts the spread of Babylon. And Babylon becomes the dominant force within a couple of years. His son is a guy named Nebuchadnezzar, and at that time he was an incredible military leader. He's the one that led the conquest that ended up going against Pharaoh Necho and defeating Egypt for the first time. First time in history, really, Egypt had been defeated, and it's known as the Battle of Carchemish. A historic battle takes place right outside of Israel, of the Israeli borders, and on his way back through after defeating Egypt, he lays siege for the first time to Israel and just demolishes the city. Part of the thing that you have to, the perspective of this, and this is confirmed in many historical narratives, one of the ways that Nebuchadnezzar built his empire is he was not a destroyer. He had this obsession with bringing the best and the brightest. He wanted all the best of every civilization to pull the best architecture, the beauty out of every society, and at the same time he would capture all of their promising elite, bring them back, and was developing this super culture where he thought by taking the best of each society, then you learn their architecture, you learn their medicine. You're not just destroying civilization, you bring it all back to Babylon, and Babylon becomes this mecca of knowledge and enlightenment. And we kind of joke about we have the Sunday school notion or the VeggieTales notion of the magicians and the astrologers in Nebuchadnezzar and King Darius's court, that they were kind of this foolish, worthless group, because that's the way the text portrays them. You would be shocked at how much of modern science was developed in Babylon. What we think of as astrology is like the horoscopes, but they were the ones that came up with this idea of a 365 and a quarter year. They were the ones that many of our mathematical concepts and principles were established out of Babylon. That area, it's known as the Fertile Crescent, or the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, was the beginning of true civilization, and so much of what we know today, the science that we still use, was established during that time, and it was just a period of a tremendous enlightenment, and it was partly because of Nebuchadnezzar's idea of bringing all these pieces of every culture they conquered back together, the best of every culture, and consolidating it in Babylon and using that to build the empire instead of just wrecking all the things that he took over. And that's what we're going to see. During the second siege, Nebuchadnezzar Jehoiakim, after Nebuchadnezzar has laid siege to Jerusalem, leaves their government in place. Jehoiakim gets full of himself and rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah, this is where he comes in. You've heard of the weeping prophet. Jeremiah's entire ministry is telling his own nation you're going to be destroyed. That Nebuchadnezzar is the right hand of God. He is here for judgment, and he is going to destroy Jerusalem. Don't rebel. Just submit to his authority. God is going to use him, and over and over and over, the kings of Israel listen to the false prophets who tell them, no, you're God's chosen people. These are heathens, and they get full of themselves and rebel. And after the third time that happens, Nebuchadnezzar's had enough of it. At that point, Nebuchadnezzar has died. Nebuchadnezzar became king of Babylon and had returned to Babylon. And he's just done. And he lays waste to the entire city of Jerusalem and most of the nation of Israel. That's what's known as the destruction of the temple in the Old Testament, was the period when Nebuchadnezzar finally lays waste to the city. In between those sieges, at the same time, after Jehoiakim's his rebellion, they did this practice that Nebuchadnezzar was famous for. The text says they took 11,000 of royalty and the best and the brightest of the children of Israel, and they captured them, brought them back to Babylon. And that was their practice everywhere. They would take hostages, basically, and they would take them to their court. But it was like the scholars, the royalty, the top crust of every field. It wasn't just grabbing 11,000 random people. It was a well-documented practice that made their empire strong. And so that's where we set the scene for Daniel 1. Is Daniel and his friends, those that we hear of, everyone here knows them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were part of that first deportation. So it's before the final fall, before the final destruction. It was in between those sieges when they took the captives, and Daniel would have been a captive in Babylon while Jerusalem was still standing, and would have been a captive when Nebuchadnezzar goes back and lays waste to the city and the temple. So that's kind of the timeline. We talked about that quite a bit last week. That sets the stage. Chapter 1 is as straightforward as it can be. This is the story of Daniel's captivity, of them going into captivity in Babylon. I think the important thing to recognize is Babylon's pretty new on the scene at this point, and it's only going to stick around about 70 years. It's going to be an insanely large and insanely powerful world empire, probably the largest, the first one to conquer on a all of known civilization scale, but it's really going to burn out quickly. And the captivity is going to span the length of the entirety of the Babylonian Empire, which was only about 70 years. So chapter 1 starts, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So we set that in context. I think last week we talked about, I don't know if I mentioned, Zedekiah is the last king of Israel. He is going to be our last king of Judah, the southern kingdom. Zedekiah is the last one. He was left as a vassal after Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to the city a second time. He puts Zedekiah in as a vassal king and says, you can continue to rule, but he takes Jehoiachin as a hostage to ensure his good performance. Zedekiah gets full of himself, listens to the false prophets, and one of the most incredible prophecies is Jeremiah is telling him, it receives a prophecy that says, you will be taken to Babylon and you will be killed there. And then Habakkuk has a prophecy that says, you will not see Babylon, right? And that creates this tension for Zedekiah. That creates this tension for Zedekiah, and it becomes this opportunity to mock the prophets. You guys say you're prophets of God, you can't even get your story straight. One of you says, I'll be taken to Babylon and I'll be killed there. The other says, I'll never see Babylon. Well, Zedekiah goes ahead and rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. When he finally does take him, he kills all 6 of his sons in front of him and then puts out Zedekiah's eyes and then takes him captive and brings him to Babylon, where he is killed. He fulfills that prophecy in the most precise way. He was taken to Babylon and he was killed in Babylon, though he never saw Babylon. And so you start to get an appreciation for the precision of the prophecy, of the prophetic scope. There's snacks up there if you want to grab some. Yeah, just don't sit by her. She's allergic to all the snacks I brought, which is awesome. Yep. Literally like 7 people here to keep alive, and I brought the thing that'll kill one of them.
That's pretty impressive.
It's really, yeah. Couldn't do that if you tried. So I think part of what I appreciate about going through these books is just the precision. Is like, how can this be anything but the God of the universe narrating the text when you see something as precise as 2 prophets are mocked for having conflicting prophecies, and yet both are fulfilled in the same event that they're predicting. And if you think that's precise, the stuff that we're going through tonight is just blows that out of the water. So in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So that'll be the 2nd siege. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. This is something I want us to all be very conscious of as we study the entire book of Daniel, right? Daniel becomes a model of wisdom. Daniel is held up as one of the most righteous men in the Bible. And you should be asking yourself, how does Daniel serve an evil world dictator who was by every account a psychopath? And I mean, you'll even just see it come through in the text. He just threatens to slaughter everyone. He has his generals. He has 11 of his generals roasted while he eats dinner, and watches them burn when they lost their first battle that they lost. I mean, just the accounts of Nebuchadnezzar are awful. Does Daniel then say, I'm against the Babylonian Empire. I will not serve. That's not my king, right? We have this tendency, which I think is a uniquely 20th, 21st century privilege of thinking we have the right to question those placed in authority over us. And if you just think back to being in the church during the last election, like, Joe Biden is not my president. There's this idea of resistance against anyone that you disagree with, that's not along the lines of biblical ideology, that I'm not subject to their authority because they don't do what the Bible commands. Let's go through the list. If you can find me a Bible character other than Moses is called by God to rebel against the Pharaoh, Joseph is taken into captivity, becomes a servant of a tyrant. Esther delivers the Jews by marrying the king of the king of Persia. Daniel spends his entire career as a second to 2 world dictators who are, by all accounts, sick beyond measure. I could go through probably 20 of these. Nehemiah becomes friends with Artaxerxes Longimanus, and that's the thing that led to his decree to restore and rebuild the temple. He's the cupbearer and the closest, it says a close of kin to the king. And then there's another guy by the name of Jesus. Does Jesus rebel against, I don't know if you're big on world history, but either Caesar Augustus or any of the successive emperors of Rome were not exactly living in the light of the Lord, and yet he calls, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God. And when he's called before, he's subjugates himself to the worldly authorities, even to death. When he's called before Pilate, does he push back? He says, you would have no power except that my Father gave it to you. He acknowledges that he is in control, he is in authority because God put him there. And I think this idea that we're called to obstinance and rebellion comes from the fact that we don't have a big enough view of God, right? How in control is God of what's going on? If you believe he's not, then it's up to you to push back against the people that are in authority over you. If you believe he is in control, then it is up to you to serve the authorities that are placed over you up until the point when they conflict with what God's told you to do, right? It does not mean you have to go along, you're called to go along with every edict. And you'll see that in Daniel, you'll see that in Christ, you'll see that in every single one of these people. When there is something that is contrary to what God has commanded, that is the point when, if there's a rub, you serve God. God is your foremost authority. But short of that, every biblical figure that you can think of subjects themselves to these authorities that are over them. And we find over and over and over that God is the one that allowed Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Israel and place the Jews under his control. So who are you to then say, I won't serve in this capacity when it's God's hand that allowed it to happen? Who are you to say, I won't recognize this president or this governor or whatever because I don't agree with their ideology, when God allowed them to be in the position they are in? It's an egotism that we have that's unique to Americans, but just ask yourself, how big is your God? Is he in control or is he not? Did he put you in this situation? It's not that I'm great at this, but I am not Democrat or Republican. I am a monarchist, and my king is still on the throne, no matter who happens to be ruling and who happens to be in authority directly over me. I'm waiting for David. I don't really care who's in governance in the meantime, and that's kind of the way that I get through it. And it's sort of a stick your head in the sand because you don't want to look type thing. But I do believe, if you're taking an honest view of what would Daniel do in this situation, what would Daniel have done under the Biden administration? Would Daniel be out there with his anti-Biden flags at a church, or protesting the things because I don't agree with what the government is doing? Absolutely not. He became a servant. He subjected himself to that. And because he did so, Nebuchadnezzar himself is going to write chapter 4, where he declares that the God of Daniel is the one and only God of the universe, right? And because of his service, Cyrus is going to publish a decree throughout the known world that says the God of the Jews is that God. He calls him that God, right? That is the kind of results. Esther saves the entire Jewish race because she has subjected herself to those who are placed in authority over her. If she had said, no, I'm just not participating, these aren't my people, I don't agree with you, right? That makes for really a lot less exciting of a story than what we got, and I just think it's worth processing when the decisions of someone that's placed over you conflict with your morals. Who's in control? Who's ultimately there? Do I believe that God is in control of the situation, and what's my obligation? Romans 13:1 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except for God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. I don't know how much more specific you can get than that, right? And so I find it very hypocritical for the church to take a position on politics, that you are taking a position against the authority that God has placed above you. It's issue by issue. The church has a voice and is supposed to speak to righteousness, but on a political stage, God is on the throne and you're supposed to be pursuing him. So that's a for your own study, for your own reflection type thing, not a deep biblical insight by any means, I don't think. So the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. So gave the king of Israel and the entire nation of Judah into the hands of a pagan king, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. We're going to see this come up in a really powerful way in the story of Belteshazzar and the handwriting on the wall. So it's an interesting footnote here. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the noble young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and a quick understanding, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they had teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them daily provisions of the king's meat. It says meat, the word is for food, and of the wine which he drank, and for 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. So if you remember, we talked about 11,000 of the captives were taken out of Judah when the city was on the second siege. They're brought in, and there's this formal program that's happening, right? The king of Babylon at the beginning of this was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's putting this program in place in which he's testing and trying these 11,000. He's trying to identify the best and the brightest, and he develops this council of advisors. And it's the story the Bible lays out, but there's also a really long, the historical narrative of this is basically that was the root for the rise of Babylon, is they took the power of each of the empires they conquered and really used the knowledge that was built up in each of those cultures and brought it back to Babylon. Everything they'd learned in medicine, architecture, this is a pretty well-known practice. And you can find documentation both in and out of the Bible. What's interesting to me and what I think the text implies from some of the language is that we started with 11,000. We may be getting down to 4. After the end of this, we're down to a handful at this point. It says they selected certain ones of the 11,000 that were brought that had no blemish, that were good looking, that possessed knowledge, and they started a 3-year training program. And we're going to see here, it just kind of skips over that 3-year training program. We see the results of it. And so that's kind of where we are here. Now, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name of Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And I think there's, as we've done this 1,000 times in every chapter we've gone through, you run across a biblical name. By now, if you've taken nothing away from this study, please interpret the names. Every language of the ancient culture, this is both in Aramaic and in Hebrew, names have meanings, and we've done this 1,000 times. And I just think it's interesting because there's some wordplay and there's some gamesmanship here. Their names were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I think it's very consistent with what we've done in the entire Bible. We always remember anything that's not Jewish, right? We remember their John, not Jonas. We take their Greek names and forget their Hebrew names if we like them. In this case, we take their Babylonian names, and we all remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But one of the things, with the little we've gone over language in this course, you should immediately pick up that every one of these guys within their name is the name of God. The El is God general. The Yah is Yehovah. So it's either El, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, or Azariah. Each one of their names. Daniel means prince of God. The name means judge of God, but if you've read the book of Judges, there are no princes in Israel. God is king over Israel, and he appointed one king. And so they called themselves the judges, when really they were the rulers, right? So their idea of a judge is a ruler. Moses was a judge over the people. Deborah, Samson, the entire book of Judges. When you hear in the Bible it says you are a judge of the people, it means a prince. But remember that God is the king, and his prince is a very specific person, so they used a different title, right? And so keep that flows throughout the whole Bible. So Daniel's name means prince of God. Hananiah means anointed of God. Mishael means who is like God. Azariah means salvation of God. All of these are very messianic names, and you can play some games with that. And yet we disregard that. Instead, we take their Babylonian names, which Belteshazzar, the prince of the eunuchs, says he changed their names to literally just put the pagan god in their name. So Belteshazzar is Baal, Shadrach is Roch, and Meshach is Yah, and then Abednego is Nego, which were each Aramaic or Babylonian gods. So Daniel's name becomes Baal's appointed prince. We all know Baal. Shadrach becomes illuminated of the sun god instead of anointed of God. Meshach becomes who is like the moon god. And Abednego, Nego is the god of knowledge. It's the servant of Nego. Right? So it's interesting to me that instead of keeping their Hebrew names that all worship God, we sing our little Sunday school song and say, who is like thou? Who we worship the moon god, right? And adopt their pagan names. I think it's interesting that it shows what they were trying to do. There's a purpose to what they're doing with these young men. They were probably 17, 15 to 17 when they started the program, 20 when they finished the program, and they're very young and they're being indoctrinated into this system. And that makes what's about to happen next even more impressive.
If this was the head of the eunuchs who was doing this, he was probably taking them younger. If he was going to make eunuchs of them, he had to do it before they were adolescent.
There's a lot of speculation to wondering if they actually did, if they became eunuchs, if they were taken. That I haven't seen anything that actually confirms that, but you're right. The idea is they were taken into captivity in the 11,000. They were probably taken into captivity when they were very, very young. So maybe early teens when they're starting this program, and it says it's a 3-year education course to teach them all the ways of the Chaldeans. And so here's where Daniel steps up. It says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then would my head, or then you would endanger my head before the king. So this kind of, it puts you in, it highlights the gravity of the situation. This is the king's first servant. This is his chief administrator. The chief of the eunuchs is Nebuchadnezzar's right-hand administrator. He's worried for his head if these kids even look peckish, if they don't look well-fed. Imagine the courage of a 17-year-old who the faith that was instilled in that high school age kid to defy the will of the king in an empire that's not even Jewish. There is no Judaism anymore. He is standing alone to say, I'm holding to the faith that I learned, and I am going to defy the king of the known world in order to stay faithful to these laws that I was raised, right? What a powerful faith that he is. I mean, how many 17-year-olds do you know that would actually even just stand up and say they're Christian in front of non-believers, and risk the scorn? Not to mention a 17-year-old who has the faith to be able to test God, to say, do what he's about to say I won't defile myself. And a lot of people will take this and say, well, this is an argument for vegetarianism or veganism, that they said, well, we're not going to eat the meat from the king's table. What he's saying is he's going to maintain the Levitical kosher laws, right? They're not observing. They're not draining the blood from their food. They're not doing all the things that are under the Levitical law. And so Daniel's saying, I won't defile myself. I will remain faithful to the law. So he goes to, what it doesn't say here is he goes to the chief of the eunuchs and he says, why should I take this risk? Why would I endanger my own head? So Daniel goes to someone else. So he persists. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs has set over Daniel, Hananiah, Meshach, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us pulse to eat. Pulse was like a grain mush, like oatmeal basically, and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's meat, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And as for the 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in literature and wisdom. And Daniel among the 4 had this unique understanding. Daniel had understanding in all vision and dreams. 10 days is a biblical period of trial. And so even in this, it's kind of sticking to the Levitical. If you're going to try give testimony by trial, it's a 10-day period. So even that has some significance here. But the faith that Daniel has, that I'm going to eat just oatmeal, me and my 3 friends are going to eat just oatmeal for 3 days, and I know that because I'm being faithful to what God called us to do, I'll put my life on the line, that I'm going to eat nothing but oatmeal for 10 days, and I'm going to look just as healthy and wholesome as everyone else that's eating the king's meat. That's how much he trusted God. I mean, you don't quite get the statement he's making, but he fully believes that as long as I'm faithful to the kosher laws, that God will nourish me on oatmeal for 10 days, and I will look just as healthy as those eating everything else. And I'll bet my life on the fact that God's going to do it, and the life of my 3 friends. I think this is the theme of the book of Daniel. Daniel's faith is so incredibly powerful that it's never even second guessed. It's always stated as just common fact. Now, in the end of the 10 days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. So this is the king's brought in all from various cultures. It says even some of the royalty of Babylon, and he tests them. He has whatever this process that his father had put in place. And among them all, he finds these 4 Jewish young boys to be wiser, more knowledgeable, and elects them to serve before the king. And in all manners of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Keep in mind that at the end of these days, it just told you before, this period of trial was 3 years. So there's a time gap between when they do this test, right? When they do the dietary test, and the prince of the eunuchs allows them to keep on the diet, and then at the end of that 3 years, now they're before Nebuchadnezzar. So this takes us past the period of the final destruction of Jerusalem, and we're now into the period when Nebuchadnezzar is in Babylon and is reigning and ruling, and these boys have gone through their trial and test period. This idea, we talked about this at the outset, and I want just to reiterate, I think from a historical standpoint, don't get caught up in this idea that these magicians, soothsayers, and astrologers were somehow frauds or anything. If you believe the Bible, you must address the fact that there are some weird, mystical things going on, right? Remember that the Pharaoh's advisors, were able to duplicate the miracles that Aaron performed at God's command up to a point. Right? They were able to do the same things. They were able to, and I don't think we're talking about parlor tricks. I think the Bible would have said if it was a deception, but it says they were able to duplicate it. Fast forward a couple years from now, there's going to be a man coming on the scene who is going to be performing miracles on a global scale, very publicly. Demonic forces have this same ability to perform miracles and do signs and wonders. And just take your Bible from cover to cover and scrub your bias and put aside this desire to sound cool. There's a lot of weird mysticism, right? Even in Israel alone, we see 2 magicians that were named by name and said they were able to practice magic in Israel and had many people following them. Simon and Elymas. Saul visits the witch of Endor, who is acknowledged to have occultic powers, and she is able to summon Samuel. And we see an encounter where the witch summons Samuel. She is then terrified of this apparition that shows up, and Saul has an encounter with Samuel in which Samuel tells Saul he's going to die for this. And these are weird, this is a fraction. There are so many sorcerers, soothsayers, magicians that are performing magic in the Bible. You can't pass that off as fancy and fiction. Right? You either believe the Bible means what it says and says what it means, and you take it at face value, or you can take it back and say, well, maybe they fooled the Holy Spirit, right? Maybe these magicians, the Holy Spirit didn't really understand the sleight of hand that they were pulling, and the people were just simple. Because it says they were performing doing magic and performing miracles in the sight of the people. There is far more. I believe that in Satan's strategy to pull us away from the knowledge of the divine, one of the most powerful tactics is to just say there is no spiritual. The effect of us seeing people do miracles now, good or bad, would cause you to embrace the spiritual. Instead, he's taken the other approach and just said that stuff doesn't happen, right? You'll never see that. That's just old-time superstition. because we're too knowledgeable. We're too enlightened for that type of stuff. And so in doing so, Satan has absolutely blinded our eyes to the spiritual around us. I think if we still saw things happening in the same way that they happened then, if we saw miracles performed by servants of God or servants of Satan, we would be forced to embrace this idea of the divine, of the spiritual realm. Instead, it's just the screw tape letters approach. Your first course of victory is to convince them that you do not exist. That's chapter 1 of screw tape letters, where the older demon is instructing his younger cousin on how to deceive man. Chapter 1 is your first and foremost goal should be to convince them that you do not exist. Right? That's what Satan is about now, and it's working tremendously. We would prefer to spin the Bible in a way that makes it palatable and sound cool and focus on the things that are acceptable socially, and not really talk about these things like witches and wizards and kind of mock the soothsayers of the Babylonians. There's a reason they rose to prominence and power. It wasn't parlor tricks. And so chapter 1 ends, thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. And that's kind of an after footnote, just saying Daniel and his 3 friends rose into prominence in the Babylonian Empire. Remember, Cyrus is the king of Persia, the next world empire that's going to dominate. He's not even Babylonian. And I am just using this excuse to tell what I believe to be the coolest story in the entire Bible. One of the coolest. The 70 weeks of Daniel is pretty impressive, but this one is equally amazing. And we'll talk about it a little bit in the fall of Babylon that happens after the Belshazzar's party and the handwriting on the wall, and we see the Persians come in and capture. If you remember last week, we talked about during that party that Belshazzar, this is about 40 years after Nebuchadnezzar, 30 years after Nebuchadnezzar dies. There's a whole series of the monarchy in Babylon becomes a slaughterhouse. They just start killing each other, and there's a bunch of intrigue. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar is like the stepson of one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, and he takes the throne, except he leaves Babylon and doesn't even want to be a ruler, and so he puts his son on the throne, a guy named Belteshazzar. And he is absolutely lecherous by every standard. History records him as being pretty rough. And he is the one that's throwing the party in the Daniel's last historical chapter, or second to last historical chapter, when Daniel is called in to interpret this handwriting on the wall. What was happening was they believe Babylon is impenetrable. Babylon's walls were, some said 60 to 80 feet high, right? 60 to 80 feet high and wide enough that you could race chariots 4 abreast. Like, these were massive walls, and they encircled the city, and within the city, they encircled the river that ran through, right? The river supplied, so they were siege-proof. The river flowed into the city underneath the double-walled gates, underneath these gates, these walls that were so big, the river flowed right into it, so you couldn't even besiege the city because it had a source of food and water, and so it was basically impenetrable. So when the Persians come to conquer Babylon, just out of pride and arrogance, Belteshazzar couldn't care less. He throws a massive party and isn't even defending the city. History records that while that happened, a guy named, I screwed up his name last week, Naburu, is the general of the Persian Empire. He goes about a quarter mile upriver, or 3/4 of a mile upriver from Babylon, and diverts the Euphrates. He spends months digging trenches and diverts the river temporarily so that the river goes dry and his armies literally walk underneath the walls and take over Babylon without a battle. And if you ever go to the British Museum, there's an exhibit called The Cylinder of Cyrus, where he brags about having taken over the city of Babylon without a battle. It says there were 5 days before the people even realized it had been conquered. And so that's how they came in and took the city. That's a really important background when you hear this story. One of the things that people contest about the book of Daniel is, okay, it's bizarre enough to believe that these Jewish captives rose to prominence to be second in command in the Babylonian Empire. They're not even Babylonian, and yet he somehow became an advisor to a world dictator. And then you want me to believe within 3 years He was then an advisor, second in command, an advisor to the country that came in and destroyed Babylon. This is surely fiction, right? Like, that sounds nonsense. There's no possible way that someone can rise to prominence in another world empire that fast, right? Except Josephus tells us that when Cyrus, when his general takes over, about 5 days later is when he says people realize it had been conquered, when they bring a big procession and Cyrus shows up to Babylon and they have a big parade in his honor. Flavius Josephus is the primary historian of Jewish history. He records that when Cyrus came, there's an 87-year-old Jewish prophet standing there with a copy of the scroll of Isaiah and reads it to him. And I will just read you a very significant portion of that scroll where Daniel is reading to Cyrus and Isaiah writes, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him and loose the loins of kings." We talked about that last week a little bit. Part of the things it says, when Belteshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall, it says his knees smote one against another and his loins were loosed. It means he defecated himself. And that became like a mockery of him that's even recorded in Josephus, that, before he was taken away, he had soiled himself in fear. And Isaiah prophesies the king of Babylon soiling himself. Whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him and loose the loins of kings, to open before him the double doors so that the gates will not be shut. Now this next part, you can appreciate Cyrus hearing his own name in here. That might be astounding. This next part, I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hidden riches of secret places. Each one of those, and we'll go through it when we go through the story of Belteshazzar, each one of those is one of Cyrus's main victories. One of the ways in which he conquered four different cities without a battle. He became famous for doing this without a battle. And each one of these describes the manner in which he conquered 4 different city-states, in order in which he conquered them, written in Isaiah. So Cyrus is hearing not only his name, but it just laid out in order your last 4 conquests and the manner in which you performed them. And he says, why am I saying this? That you may know that I, the Lord, who calls you by your name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake and Israel my elect, I have called you by your name. I have named you, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. One of the things you won't find in most of the Bible, God does not argue for himself. There's only a few places in which he talks himself up, one of which is being the book of Job. And this is one of the other primary places where God just argues for himself. And he's doing it for the purpose of justifying himself to a pagan king. And so it makes sense, but it's awesome to hear God talk about himself in prophecy. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and its setting that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. The 2 primary gods of Persia were the god of war and peace and the god of light and darkness. They had 2 primary deities. They weren't like the Greeks or the Romans. They were dual theistic. And he says, I am the Lord. There is no other. And he specifically addresses the 2 attributes of the 2 gods of the Persians, again, in the book of Isaiah. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. If that wasn't specific enough, as if that's not like just incredibly precise, goes on to say, thus says the Lord, your Redeemer. So now talking to the nation of Israel. And he who formed you from the womb, I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by himself, who frustrates the sins of the babblers and drives diviners mad, who turns wise men backwards and makes their knowledge foolishness, who confirms the word of his servants, so who confirms prophets, and performs the counsel of his messengers, who says to Jerusalem, you shall be inhabited. Jerusalem was fully built at the time of this prophecy, right? When Isaiah's writing, Jerusalem is standing. It hasn't even been destroyed. This doesn't make sense when Isaiah's writing it. He says to Jews, you shall be to Jerusalem, you shall be inhabited. To the cities of Judah, you shall be built, and I will raise her up her waste places. Who says to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up your rivers. Who says to Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasures. Even saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundations shall be laid. He tells Cyrus what he's going to say. But more importantly, he lays out the manner in which he was going to conquer. He conquered Babylon right before he was reading this scroll, right? Cyrus's army had just diverted the river, dried up the river so he could enter Babylon. And there's a guy standing here with a scroll that reads, who says to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up your rivers. And who says to Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform my pleasures. Saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temples your foundations shall be laid. Can you imagine, if you're Cyrus, are you impressed at this point? Do you like, how incredible would this be? I can tell you exactly how impressed Cyrus was. This was also in black and white, recorded 140 years before Jerusalem was even destroyed. So there is no refuting that this is after the fact. It was written almost 180 years before Cyrus read it. Multiple generations. Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews records, accordingly, when Cyrus read this and admired the divine power and earnest desire and ambition seized upon him to fulfill what was so written, so he called for the most eminent Jews that were in Babylon and said to them that he gave them leave to go back to their own country and rebuild their city, Jerusalem, and the temple of God, that he would be their assistant, and that he would write to the rulers and governors that were in the neighborhood for their country of Judea, that they should contribute to them gold and silver for the building of the temple, and besides that, beasts for the sacrifices. Cyrus wrote this throughout all of Asia. Thus saith Cyrus the king, since God Almighty has appointed me to be king of the habitable earth. What a thing to say. He literally makes a proclamation to the known world saying the God of Israel is the one that put him on the Persian throne. He is accepting what is said in Isaiah as being truth, that he has been named as this God's right hand. Thus saith Cyrus, since God Almighty hath appointed me to be king of the habitable earth, I believe that he is that God which the nation of the Israelites worship. For indeed he foretold my name by the prophets that I should build him a house in Jerusalem in the country of Judea. And that is the stage, that is the event that gives rise to everything you read in the rest of the Old Testament. Ezra and Nehemiah are then, the Bible doesn't explain why, but they're given leave to leave the Persian Empire and go restore and rebuild the city. And they spend 40 years trying to build the temple until this final decree of Artaxerxes says, okay, fine, you guys can build walls and have a standing army and defend yourself as well. But the Bible doesn't explain why all of a sudden this despotic king just picks this one group of people and says, okay, I'll allow you to go rebuild your homeland and leave as a population. He was very impressed by this. And you can see then, if Daniel is the one that's standing there showing why within 3 years that guy becomes an advisor to the king of Persia. Right? This guy was very clearly impressed. He puts a decree out to the known world declaring that the God of Israel is the one God. Right? That is incredible. That's incredibly profound and right up there with what Nebuchadnezzar is going to publish in chapter 4. But the precision of that prophecy, you will not find anything in Scripture that is that precise. And we're going to go through it when we do the subsequent study. I think it's in chapter 5. But you can literally lay out the history of Cyrus's conquest in those weird statements that he makes straight the crooked places, that he breaks the bands of iron and looses their specific allusions to different ways in which he conquered. And it is all laid out 140 years in advance of Jerusalem even falling, not to mention Persia was not even a city-state at that time. Assyria was the world governing power when Isaiah wrote that. Babylon hasn't even risen. Persia would subsequently rise. We're still 2 world empires away when he names the king of Persia. That's precision of prophecy. When you can say you have confidence that this word is inspired by God, you can't possibly manufacture that. Okay, so we're at 1 hour, and I'm not into chapter 2. Do we want to, it's probably 30 more minutes, do we want to keep going or pause and take that next week? Any votes?
I could either way.
Keep going? Okay, yep, we'll keep going. Okay, chapter 2, this is where it gets really interesting. That was. I think that's fascinating. I'll use any opportunity to talk about Cyrus, and it's not actually recorded in Daniel, so I had to slip it in a couple places. But this is where it gets real interesting. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and that is the Hebrew of that, you might get confused because Nebuchadnezzar's now been back from the second siege by the time we're now in like year 9 or 10 since Nabopolassar died and Nebuchadnezzar took over. What it's saying is 2 years from his reign over the Israelites. It's 2 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. They're reckoning it from their time, and it's really specific in the Hebrew. It's like a personal his reign over us. It would be the way you could translate it. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the commandment to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Not to know the meaning of it, right? Very important here. Then the Chaldeans spoke to him, and this idea of the Chaldeans, that becomes, when it always says the magicians, soothsayers, astronomers, all these various job titles. It starts using that more in the broad term. Chaldeans is like everyone in that job description, and it's just there are various forms of the occult, and you can do a deep study into the differences between each, but they really overlap a ton. Just know that this culture is steeped in the occult, and those who had these occultic powers rose to prominence and became significant as advisors, and that's kind of how we got to this point. Now, what's sort of recorded here and what we kind of learned from history is that Nabopolassar had this idea of bringing people in from other cultures and bringing in outside advisors and accumulating. Nebuchadnezzar, as we'll see in the text, was insanely arrogant. He was very self-serving. He didn't want advisors. He didn't want a staff, and he didn't see the value in this program of bringing people from other cultures. He saw Babylon as being self-sufficient. And so what he's doing here, it sort of comes across in the text, but it's explained later. He's trying to find out, he's saying, I think you guys are full of crap, right? I think you guys are worthless. I don't need advisors. He's going to put them to a test he thinks nobody can pass as an excuse to show that they don't have any power and put them to death. But these are his father's advisors that he was saddled with, and he's going to put them to the test. So he says, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king, and it's got the note here in Aramaic. That's actually like a drafting note. The rest of the book of Daniel, the rest of chapters 2 through 7 will be in Aramaic, in the language of Babylon. So the rest of this writing, it shifts languages here from Hebrew to Aramaic as we get into the non-Jewish aspects of this story. And then once we get into the prophecies that deal with the nation of Israel, he's going to switch back to Hebrew. And that's another reason people say, well, no, 2 different people wrote this book. But really, he's writing in the language of the people he's talking to and that these prophecies deal with. This is going to lay out the history of the Gentiles in advance. And then when he talks about Israel, he's going to shift back to Hebrew. So from here on out, we're using Aramaic. But the Chaldeans spoke to the king and said, O king, live forever, which is just the common address of the king. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give you the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut into pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. Right? They can come up with anything. As you tell us what it is, and we'll come up with some spin on it. But he's got that figured out. The king answered and said, I know for a certain that you would gain the time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed amongst yourselves to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed, till I change my mind. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. You tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll believe you when you give me an interpretation of it. He's truly troubled by this dream, but he's using it as an opportunity to test these so-called advisors that he inherited from his father. The Chaldeans answered the king and said once again, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is difficult, the thing the king requests. I like that. It is difficult, the thing the king requests. And there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. He is absolutely, they're right there. It's one of those things where they're affirming the power of God and not even realizing. They're saying there's no man that can tell these things, only the gods. What's really revealing is they have that knowledge that there are gods who can reveal this thing, but they are also have knowledge that they're not going to get it from them, right? They're not saying, let us petition our gods and we will get that. They have no thought that they can go to God and get this answer to their gods. Yet they know there are gods out there that have these answers. It's very revealing of the knowledge that they had. They know of gods that have these powers. They also know they're not going to answer for them. I don't know why, but it's clear that they understand this paradigm. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now that term wise men gets mishmashed with the magicians and the magi and such. The wise man is the broad category. It's all those people that were brought in from other cultures to advise the king. That they're not just the astrologers, soothsayers, and magicians. It's the ones from every different culture. He's saying every advisor that my dad brought in from this program, including the ones that came up out of the Babylonian system, all the advisors are going to be put to death. And Daniel happens to be in that job description, right? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Meshach, and Azariah are of that class of wise men. They're not magi, they're not magicians, soothsayers, or astrologers, but they're in that group of advisors. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch. I skipped something here. So, okay, I'm struggling to go back. So Daniel learns of this decree. He is in this job description of one of the wise men that is now subject to this decree of the king. And then with the counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. And he answered and said to Arioch the king, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch, or why so hasty? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. So clearly he already has access to the king. He goes in and says, hey, I know you're killing out everyone in my job description, but give me a minute and I will do this thing. Like, that's incredible faith. The wise men, the soothsayers just said, hey, there are gods, only the gods out there have this information. They're not going to tell us. Daniel goes before the king and says, give me a minute. I'm going to go get the answer. Right? He understands. The faith that goes behind that is, he doesn't try to flee. He goes to the king directly. So Daniel and the king, he has standing before the king enough that the king doesn't put him to death on the spot. As he's doing with the rest of the wise men, he gives him the time. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was, so Daniel comes back and says, guys, we got to have a prayer meeting. We're going to figure this thing out. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So what does Daniel do? Daniel blessed the God of heaven, right? Imagine just getting this vision from God, the relief. He's mortal. He's worried about being killed, him and all his friends and everyone that's in his job description. And in the night, God reveals it to him. And Daniel answered and said this. And what I love most is even Daniel's worship is wise, right? Like you want to talk about the wisdom of Daniel. His praise is,
Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the themes of the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light that dwells within him. Every one of those is a quotation back to the writings of Solomon. Even his worship is quoting who is without a doubt, and Holy Spirit testifies, the wisest man to have ever lived. Solomon was renowned for his wisdom, and when God granted him one boon, he wanted wisdom. And so the writings of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs are Solomon's wise sayings. And Solomon called himself a collector of dark things or dark sayings, but by that he means like secret things, not dark that we think of it, but like he pursued the deeper things of God, and God revealed deep truths to him. And here's Daniel. Even in his worship, he's excited and he's quoting Proverbs, right? And you can just go through each one of these, and I won't go through them individually. The one that I think is really interesting is he says, he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He gives wisdom to those who fear the Lord, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. He's saying, I get understanding because of my fear of God and my knowledge of the Holy One, because I'm pursuing the Holy One. He's using these exact same principles that Solomon wrote down, and I just love the fact that even his worship is just so deeply wise. It's not just like, God, you are good. God, thank you. How mighty are you? He's going through in the attributes of God and how God is known and how he makes himself known. O God of my fathers, you have given me wisdom and might and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand. Therefore Daniel went back to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went to him and said, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me again to the king, before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. So Daniel approaches. Arioch at first tells him what's going on, but doesn't deliver him. He has to go to the king. But then when he goes back to Arioch gives the perfectly political answer. So Arioch brought Daniel before the king and said to him, I have found a man. I love that. I love the fact that Daniel approaches him, yet when he goes before the king, I have found you a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. And so this sets the stage. And this gets pretty, this is the most simplistic of all the prophecies, but remembering when it's being written is what gives it so much power. So the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? And Arioch is very quick to grab credit for something he didn't do. Daniel is not. Daniel is quite the opposite. Daniel says, no, king. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, astrologers, and magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Keep in mind, this prophecy is that key term, in the latter days, right? This is focused on the end times. It says it right up front. He's telling the king the history of world empires, but the focus of this is in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came into your mind while you're on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. So Daniel is being very careful to say, this is not because of me, this is not by my wisdom, but the God of heaven, the God who reveals these, wants you to know something. You, O king, were watching, and behold a great image. The great image whose splendor was excellent stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, silver, the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So he told him exactly what he dreamed, and now he's qualified to interpret. This is the dream. Now we will tell you the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory, and wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hands and has made you ruler over them. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, and then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks into pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet of toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall then be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break into pieces and consume all the kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that stone cut out of the mountain without hands, that it broke into pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after these things. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. Interestingly, it says that phrase that the God of heaven has made known what will come to pass after these things. What was our key to the book of Revelation that started the period after the period of the church? After these things. What was the key to Christ's prophecies? What was the key to in John when he starts talking about the future? It's always cover to cover, Old Testament to New. It's a single book, and when he's talking about the end time, he says, meta tauta, after these things. So he's letting him know what shall come to pass after these things. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is true. So there's this image that Nebuchadnezzar sees of a giant statue whose head is of gold, chest and arms of silver, stomach of bronze, and legs of iron, and then that iron devolves into mixture of iron and clay. The important thing to note is you can kind of see 5 if you include that last part as a separate nation. That's not what's going on. There clearly, it says in the text, there are 4 nations. The fourth one, the iron legs, will devolve, but it is the same nation. It's not a separate empire that he's talking about. He very specifically says that. There's no interpretive ambiguity there. It is a continuation, but there is a weakening that happens as there's a mixture. So Daniel breaks this down. There isn't all that much ambiguity, except that now we have the benefit of hindsight. Right now we can look at it looking backwards. And he says there will be the Babylonian Empire. You, Nebuchadnezzar, are this head of gold. It is the only true dictatorship, right? It is the pure. Nebuchadnezzar had all unlimited authority. By the time we see the Persians come into play, we hear Darius made a decree. And once that decree was made, even he didn't have the power to reverse it, though he wanted to. And that's why he had to throw Daniel into the lion's den. It says that because he had put it in writing and it had been adopted, they had this parliamentary system, that the king was not as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar. There's a lesser form of governance, but in that it became stronger, right? The Babylonian Empire crumbles quickly because it's a one-man show, and once the head of this dictatorship devolves into Evil Merodach and all his successors, that thing crumbles like incredibly quick. Each one of these successive empires becomes stronger as the system of governance becomes stronger and as its control. And so while these metals deteriorate in value, they increase in strength until gold is softer than silver, silver is softer than bronze, bronze is softer than iron, and iron breaks apart all of those. And you can see it getting stronger as it gets less valuable. That's why he said, you are Nebuchadnezzar, are the king of kings. Your empire is absolute. that absolute control will get less, but the empire itself will get stronger. And that is a profile in advance of the world empires. In itself, it is just an incredibly accurate description. The Babylonian Empire was succeeded by the Medo-Persian Empire, which is what we see in Cyrus, and then the various Artaxerxes that came after, and that empire lasted a little bit longer until it was conquered by the Grecian Empire, as Alexander the Great literally conquers the known civilized world. At 26 years old, he falls asleep crying on his bed that there are no more known worlds left to conquer. He is the first to truly conquer everything, and the entire world speaks Greek for a period of time, which is why, even though in the biblical times the Romans are in power, they're all still speaking Greek, because it became a universal language. The Roman Empire was the dominant one. While the Grecian Empire was the largest and the fastest rising, the Roman Empire was an absolute authority. All of the successive, or the previous ones, allowed some cultural, you maintain some of your own cultural independence, right? They didn't necessarily totally integrate or wipe out everything. When the Romans conquered, they conquered absolutely. The rest of them were all proud of what they could build in culture and language. The Romans were proud of what they could destroy. All the writings of the Roman Empire, they wanted to destroy all semblance of every culture that wasn't Roman, and they literally broke into pieces everything they conquered. Very different from all the previous. Every other one was concerned with building something sustainable, integrating cultures, keeping people happy so they wouldn't rebel. Rome destroyed. And so it is this legs of iron, and it very aptly, in fact, their symbols, even weirdly enough, the symbol of the Medo-Persians was the silver lancet, the bronze was the Persian, they had a bronze shield was the emblem of the Persian Empire, and you all know the Iron Eagle of Rome, they literally, even their symbols were the metals that were cast here as they came through. And we're going to see another prophecy of the four beasts in the latter part of Daniel that even more specifically describes these successive empires in how they would conquer. But this describes the type of government and the power that they would come to. And then it gives this weird thing. It says, whereas you saw, block my text here. Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be divided. It will have the strength of iron. It will also have the weakness of potter's clay. So there's the Iron Empire. Then somehow, as it progresses, becomes mingled with clay and iron, and they're not mixed together, and it makes for a weak empire. We'll go over this in great detail when we get into the visions. The Roman Empire was never conquered. Tell me the story of who conquered Rome. Rome just sort of divided and started allowing sovereign states to govern themselves. The eastern leg of the Roman Empire, Constantine moves the capital from Rome to Byzantine, becomes Constantinople, and the eastern leg of the Roman Empire lasts until like the 1400s. Right? We still see the Roman Empire in prevalence. What we see as modern Europe is still the remnants of the Roman Empire as a republic. It was never conquered. It just kind of devolved, right? And many scholars see that what happened in Europe and the fact that it divided into separate countries as being this mixture of iron and clay, that it maintains the history of Rome, of being the empire, the Roman Empire, but it has the weakness of being divided. And I would have said that, and I taught that for many years. I believed that for many years and taught that several times, that was a reference to the weakness of the divided Roman Empire, until once again, you start taking the text seriously, until you take your time and read what the text says, right? The last part of it says, as you saw the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle with the seed of men, but they shall not adhere to one another. Right? They shall mingle with the seed of men. Meaning what? Yeah. They are not the seed of men. By very definition, and I have looked at every possible context, the kings, these things that are coming out in the latter days are mingled with the seed of men to create, but they don't mix well, right? They don't create unity. That's what it's saying. It's and very specifically, I didn't read what the word said for years and just said, well, this is clearly a prophecy that Europe would be a divided, separate governance, and which makes it weak. But that's not at all what it's talking about. It's saying the remnants of this Roman Empire will have something come in, and they will mingle with the seed of men, being separate from, but they don't mix, just as iron and clay don't mix, and it makes them weak. And it's at that point, during that period, when that mixture happens, that it says, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume these kingdoms, and it shall stand for 1,000 years, right? For the millennial reign? No, forever. We talk about the millennial reign. That is the physical location on earth. The reign of Christ that he will establish and rule from Israel will continue forever. There will never be another governance, another world empire. It is an absolute reign. But it very specifically said it is in the time of this mingling, of the mingling of these kings with the seed of men, that the God of heaven will establish his everlasting kingdom, right? Okay, so it forces you to ask the question, who are they? Who is the they that are mingling? I am not going to go deep into our Genesis 6 study. I very much recommend if you're interested in this topic to go back and do that, and we can revisit it if people are interested. But given that we're already killing the time, I got to do this lightly. Matthew 24:34, Christ is telling his disciples what will happen, and he uses the term, same term Daniel uses, in the latter day. Right? That is the purpose of this prophecy. And he says, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will not pass away. He's emphasizing the surety that this is going to happen. But at that day and hour knoweth no man, but nor the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So as the days of Noah were, that's going to be the condition of the earth when Christ comes a second time. I'm going to throw this out here. It's controversial. When it says no man knows the time, the day and the hour of his coming, which coming is he talking about? His second coming, right? It says his second coming. We convolute that and say that's talking about the rapture.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that. That's not at all what it says. It says no one knows the time and the hour when he comes, and it's very specific. This is his second coming and we're going to get into that in great detail, but we take that no man knows the hour and the time and say, well, that must mean the rapture. That's not what the text says. I believe we are called, and believe that the Bible says quite the opposite. It says, in fact, we are called to know the signs and the seasons and the times and those things that were set as foreshadow of the things which are to come, which is why I have this belief in the feasts of Israel as being prophetic. I don't believe it's no man can know. I believe he laid out a roadmap for the church. And then once the church is gone, no man can know because there's no church, right? He told me, I will do nothing except that I reveal it to my prophets, right? I will do nothing. Do you think taking his church out of the earth and coming for his faithful, that's something at least. And I believe he told us, but when we're gone, who is there to tell? So that's why it says, no one knows the time and the hour because there's no one left to know, right? We're gone. That's the purpose of this, but he is very specific. That shouldn't I tell my friends what I'm about to do? Was Abraham not my friend? Aren't these of his disciples not my friends? Shouldn't I tell my friends what I'm going to do? This idea of us knowing his plan is personal to him. It's like a love letter to us that you get to know. And so I not that I care. I don't date setting for the rapture and stuff isn't a big deal to me, but I think it's interesting that we've taken this idea of we don't know the time of the second coming and saying that applies to the rapture. It's going to happen suddenly, but it also tells us be prepared. So who cares if it happens suddenly or if you actually know? But he says, more importantly and actually on topic, as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. What do we know about the days of Noah? Very little, except that in Genesis 6:1 it says, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God, the Benioth Elohim, the direct creations of God," which is the term that's only used anywhere else in the Bible of angels. We try to twist that and make it like the sons of Seth or something, but that term is used exclusively throughout the entire text of angels. That the sons of men, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, all of which they chose. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with men, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown." I mean, you could twist that all you want, and I've heard the most creative arguments. That sounds pretty straightforward to me. Like, I think if you take the Bible on its face, it takes some real creative license to make that mean anything other than the sons of God came to the earth and cohabitated with the women of earth and bore somehow these weird offspring that had both, tremendous capacity and abnormal size. It specifically says that's happening, and that is the cause of the flood. That was the condition of the earth in the time of the flood, and here God specifically attributes the flood to the goings-on of that. When it talks about Noah, it says Noah was perfect in his generations. Was Noah sinless? Is that why he was chosen by God? Absolutely not. He was perfect in his generations. His genealogy, his line had not been contaminated with whatever was going on here, and it was free of these defects, and therefore he was chosen to support the line, right? It's consistent. Just read the text. Don't try to put a spin on it that makes it the way you want it, and it seems pretty obvious. So with that in mind, if you then reread Daniel 2:41, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Whereas you saw the feet of toes, partly of iron, potter's clay, partly of iron. The kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength shall be of iron shall be in it. And the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom will be partly strong and partly fragile." Let's see. "And in the days of these kings," the kings that are contemplated in the mixing of iron and clay, "in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed." So we've got the date, right? Now go back, and it says, "As you saw iron mixed with ceramic and clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another." It's almost the same language, right? It's talking about the genealogy. It's talking about mingling of they, whoever they are. Christ said, "As in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the end times." He's talking about the end times. He says in those times there will be a commingling and a cohabitation of something that's different from the seed of men with the seed of men that causes weakness, right? I don't know how much, to me that is very plain. I don't even think it's like an interpretation thing. It's just what it says. And it sets the stage for this idea that in the time which Christ returns, whether it's during the tribulation, pre-tribulation, or however that fits in, or even for a long period before the rapture, there is something coming that, at least from a spiritual standpoint, resembles the things that were going on in the days of Noah. Anyone who argues with you that, what it's saying is the flood came because people were so sinful in the days of Noah. What does Paul say about your sinfulness? You are saturated. In me there is no good thing. In me I am deeply evil. The heart is wicked above all things, or the heart is evil and above all things desperately wicked. How do you get more evil than completely evil, which is the condition I find myself in apart from Christ? It was not more evil in the days of Noah than it is today. They were man, they were flesh, they were the same fallen race, and they were fully sinful, just like I am fully sinful. It was not their sin that caused the flood. There was something else going on. And Jesus points to that something that caused the flood and said, it's coming again. And then Daniel says, hey, something's going to happen where they will mingle with the seed of men when that mountain that is not cut with hands comes and establishes the everlasting kingdom. there is something in that regard coming. And I think it's just intellectual and textual honesty to say that's really mystical. And, first of all, I hope I'm not around for it, but there is some truth to it. There's an absolute honesty to, there's a spiritual aspect of this. And so I think it makes very clear that that's an end time prophecy. Regardless, I don't think that's the essence of it lays out the history of the world empires in advance, and lays out the condition of the world in the time when Christ comes and establishes his everlasting kingdom. That prophecy has been so completely fulfilled in all respects except for that last piece, that it will come to pass. Whatever, even not knowing the truth of it, even not knowing the future, even not knowing that it predicted each of these empires and how it would come to pass, Nebuchadnezzar was impressed. This is the king of the known world who is on an ego trip, and you pass over it, but it says, the king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face prostrate before Daniel. He goes down to worship Daniel and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all of the wise men of Babylon. Also, Daniel petitioned the king, and he set, and this is the first time it uses their Babylonian names, he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs and province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. You bet he did. I mean, can you imagine if you had a dream that was that specific and someone came to you and said, my God has told me exactly what you dreamed, though you haven't told me. Not only do I know that, I'm going to tell you, it lays out the history of the world empires in advance. Your dream, interpret your dream to be so bold as to say, I can tell you what's going to happen throughout all of human history. Yeah, you're going to probably put that person in a position of prominence, and you can see how that might have happened. And it starts to make sense in the record. Next week, you start to see a different side of the story in what we call like the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king, again, gets on an ego trip, and this is going to be a theme for Nebuchadnezzar, is returning to God, making these profound statements, and then getting on an ego trip and doing something stupid. Does that sound like another king we're familiar with? Right? That is David. You think Nebuchadnezzar is bad? Go to David. Look at his falling on his face before God, declaring his righteousness and goodness, and then going out and utterly like turning against God, and then falling on his face. It's incredible to look at the parallels between this guy we think of as being like a maniacal dictator and a horrible human being, and that guy that we hold up as being one of the most righteous saints in David. They're pretty similar. When you start getting to it, the things that power does to a person are universal, whether you are a follower of God or secular. It's incredible. But Nebuchadnezzar is going to be impacted by Daniel because Daniel didn't rebel against the authority, but instead served his God in the presence of this authority. And over, we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar making incredible declarations for God and doing these incredible things, so much so that he's the only Gentile to write a book of the Bible. We have a book of the Bible written by a Gentile king that declares the goodness and righteousness of God. And I believe, for better or worse, that I'm going to see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. I believe that Daniel brought him with him by his service and by serving God in his presence. And that's kind of the model we should have when you start looking at, what do I do when I'm put under the authority of someone who doesn't have the same views as me? Be Daniel. Serve God. See what God does with it. You're not supposed to bash them. You're not supposed to put them down. You're not supposed to do everything you can to frustrate them. Serve God. See what God does. Why do you think it's you that's going to make a difference? And that's the model of most of the biblical characters, but Daniel's the preeminent. Joseph is also the same thing. You see consistently rising to prominence and the influence he has for the kingdom of God by subjecting himself to the authorities that God's allowed is incredible. But yeah, so exciting. Every week of this is really cool because over and over and over, you walk away from every study in Daniel just going like, you have got to be kidding me. Like that precision couldn't be made up. It's the thing that everyone has to attack first. When you say the Bible isn't inspired, you got to go after Daniel because you can't possibly explain the things that the prophecies here, and these are by far the least of them. You get into the 70 weeks of Daniel, and you're gonna talk about precision that makes even Cyrus and even these kingdom of empires pale in comparison. So looking forward to that, and I will stop